All right, well, we have jumped up to over 100 people who have joined this webinar now tonight, so I think we might get underway. Welcome, folks, as you come on this evening. My name is Lindsay, and I'm a senior campaigner here at Greenpeace Australia Pacific. I'm also the director of our newly launched Electrify campaign, which is a campaign to drive a rapid switch off coal, oil and gas and onto all electric homes, businesses and transport. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering tonight. For me here, that's in Sydney and Gaya-Maygal country. And I'd like to recognise the continued connection to and care for the land, skies and waters of this place. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders and any First Nations people present here today. So tonight's webinar is called the A-Z of EVs, Your Questions Answered. And that's what we're here for, to answer your questions. And boy, have we received a lot of them. The context for us hosting this webinar is a major transformation that is happening all around the world, with a big and rapid shift to electric vehicles underway. Here in Australia, we're just starting to catch up where other parts of the world have already been for a number of years now, in particular with a new federal government coming in, looking to do more to promote the uptake of electric vehicles and currently seeking input into a new electric vehicle strategy and what that should look like. So Greenpeace's campaign is engaging in that strategy process and is pushing for for policy measures that will lead to a much faster shift to vehicle electrification, and of course because of that crucial role it plays in cutting transport emissions. So this is a transformation that reaches into the daily lives of every Australian, anyone who needs to move from one place to another. So that does mean almost everyone. And we know that means that there's a lot of questions that people have about these changes that are underway. We also know there's a lot of mis and disinformation out there, sometimes being deliberately spread by those who would seek to slow this transition down. And so that's why we're so keen to have this webinar on tonight. And why we're so lucky to be joined by, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Jake, an EV guru in Jake Whitehead, to answer some of the questions that you have all shared with us. So quick bio on Jake before we jump into our presentation and Q&A. So Jake is the head of policy at the Electric Vehicle Council here in Australia. He's worked on transport and EV policy for over 15 years across university, corporate and government sectors. He's a lead author on the transport chapter of the IPCC 6 assessment report. He's also owned 3 different EVs over the last 6 years and has not 1, but 2 PhDs, one in transport science and one in transport engineering. So I am sure you'll agree with me that Jake is eminently qualified to talk to us about this topic tonight. And so I guess the question though is, like, how many questions can we fire at one transport guru in 1 hour? Because as I said, we've received a huge number of questions, over 400 questions from the over 400 people here on the call tonight. We're going to try and answer as many of them as possible, but I also want to apologise in advance if we don't get to your question, because there have been a great number. And as Jake just said, we were just talking before the webinar, some of these topics you could spend an entire hour just talking on them alone. But to give you a sense of the kind of questions we've received and the topics folks are interested in, we've created this word cloud. And I think it's kind of interesting to have a little look at it. You'll see some key themes emerging. I was surprised to see, well, surprised maybe not when you think about it, to see will as the biggest word there. Many questions about what will happen, will looking at the future. And of course, this is a big shift that's underway now and into the future. Lots of questions around batteries, solar, cost, environment, lithium, charging. You can see some of these themes that have come out of your questions, and these are what we're about to jump into. So in terms of format, we're going to have a quick presentation from Jake to give an overview of where things are up to here in Australia. And then we'll jump into a sort of Q&A conversational type session where I'll fire a whole lot of the questions you have submitted Jake's way, and we'll see how many he can get through. Because we have received so many questions in advance, we're not going to be taking any more from the floor, but do feel free to drop any sort of thoughts or comments in the chat as we go along. That's there for you to use. And folks from our team, Sophia and Tom, will be sharing bits and pieces of info and links in there too. I've just had a message that the chat is disabled, so I don't know if that's something that you can have a look at. So hopefully we can get that fixed and people can start using that. But okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Jake now to give us a bit of an overview of where things are at in Australia.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Lindsay, for that generous introduction, and awesome to be here tonight with all of you. I hope through this session we're able to answer the majority of questions, and I'm going to do my best to get through that content. So before we jump into those commonly asked questions about electric vehicles, I thought I would just give you a bit of a background about electric vehicles and the important contribution that they have to make to reducing transport emissions, and speak very briefly as well to this important point in time right now in Australia, where we have the opportunity to influence a national EV strategy and hopefully have the policy initiatives put in place to significantly reduce transport emissions over the next few years. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Electric Vehicle Council, just briefly, we're the peak body for the EV industry. We represent over 95 members now, which include a range of car and truck manufacturers, charging infrastructure providers, energy companies, fleet managers. It's a very broad church of enthusiastic industry members across Australia wanting to accelerate the electrification of transport so that we can all have a sustainable and prosperous future. Now, in my role as head of policy at the EV Council, we not only are having a focus on electric cars, but transport as a whole and how we can reduce emissions. And in order to understand what the solutions are to reducing emissions, we first need to understand what the problem is. And so, as Lindsay outlined earlier, the reason that I have my 2 doctorates in transport and have worked for so long in this space is that I think transport plays an abundantly critical role in all of our lives. Every single day, almost, that we have to wake up, we have to make a decision about how to get from A to B. Decisions have to be made about how food gets from the farm to our table. And this means that it's fundamental to having a good quality of life into the future. The challenge we have in transport, though, is that right now the sector is heavily reliant on oil. So it's the primary energy source in Australia and right around the world. And as a consequence, transport is a major polluter. So in many countries like the US, the transport sector is actually the largest contributor to emissions. And in Australia, it's around the 3rd, depending on how you slice and dice it. But the disappointing thing is that whilst other sectors like energy are starting to reduce emissions, unfortunately, transport emissions continue to increase. And this is a major risk to our climate targets, and of course to missing those future targets like net zero by 2050 or as early as possible. When you break down the transport sector, it's important to recognise that there are a range of different parts that contribute emissions, but cars are almost half of those emissions. And so that's why there's a lot of focus right now on how we can decarbonise the car segment of transport to reduce that significant contribution in terms of emissions. And those emissions not only have an impact in terms of climate change, but also air pollution. So they have an impact on the air we obviously breathe. That then leads to a range of cardiovascular and respiratory related illnesses. And you can also estimate how many people die early, effectively, from breathing in car pollution. And when you sum that up across the world, you're looking at somewhere around $1 trillion each year in public health costs. So this is a significant problem, not only in terms of tackling climate change, but also the cost to society. And it means it's necessary that we make some significant changes in how we run our transport systems. Whoops. So in terms of zooming in on the Australian context, as you'd probably be aware, we have very limited oil production. So we are pretty much wholly reliant on importing all of our oil. And for anyone that has a petrol or diesel car, this will be front of mind, paying $2 plus per litre this year for fuel because of those international disruptions that we are exposed to. And again, if you sum up that spending right across our economy, for private cars alone, you're looking at somewhere around $35 billion being spent each and every year on fueling our cars. And that money is largely flowing out of the country. As I've mentioned, we know that there's a significant number of premature deaths associated with that vehicle pollution right now. And in fact, even in Australia, the estimates suggest that there are more deaths from vehicle pollution than vehicle accidents. And in the Australian case of transport emissions, like what we're seeing around the world, they're continuing to increase. So if we look between 2005 and 2019, there was about a 22% increase compared to other sectors that saw a reduction. And unfortunately, without any major policy action, those emissions will still remain higher than 2005 by 2030. And clearly, that is in contrast to the direction we need to be heading of a 43% reduction minimum in the next 7 years. The key policy that's missing in this space to reduce emissions, particularly from that large segment of cars, is a fuel efficiency standard. And you'll hear a lot about that over the coming weeks and months, but also in this presentation, we'll touch on that policy in a bit more detail later. So we know this is a major problem. How can we tackle it? How do we reduce transport emissions? And look, I'm from the EV Council, but I have a long background in transport. And so I'm very passionate about taking a comprehensive approach to reducing emissions. And it's not just about electric vehicles. A really great framework that I use in a lot of my work of breaking down the approaches for reducing transport emissions is called Avoid, Shift and Improve. So the first step is avoiding all of those unnecessary trips that could potentially be, not taken or shortened. So things like what we're doing right now and telecommuting, working from home, whilst they're not an option for everyone, increasingly now they are an option for many, and that can reduce emissions by not taking the trip to begin with. That can represent about 10% of the solution. The next step down for those trips that we can't avoid is shifting them to more efficient modes. So things like public transport, shared transport, active transport. This is really important as well, because we know that just having people driving private cars is not the solution. It's not the society we want to live in. And we want to have equitable access right across the transport system where people can get to and from work, school, efficiently, cheaply, and quickly, and not be stuck in congestion. So this step represents about 30 to 40% of the solution. But after you take that out, you've still got about 50% of the problem that needs to be addressed. And that's where electric vehicles come in, to improve the energy efficiency of all transport, and not just electric cars, but electric buses, trucks, bikes, motorcycles. These are all avenues that need to be taken in order for us to reduce emissions and achieve net zero by 2050 or as early as possible. And we have to take a realistic and balanced approach in here. It's not one or the other. We need to address all of these strategies in tandem for us to have a realistic chance of achieving our targets. And don't just take my word for it. I'll quickly have this quote from the International Council on Clean Transportation that outlines electric vehicles being the single most important technology for decarbonising the transport sector. So that's why there is so much attention on this right now. And again, just to reiterate, when we're talking about electric vehicles, this isn't just electric cars, but buses, trucks. Electrifying the entire transport sector is critical for reaching our climate targets. So we've talked about electric vehicles, but it's probably good that we specify exactly what they are. What we define electric vehicles as is any vehicle that you can plug in to charge from electricity. And that's because using electricity as opposed to fossil fuels is more energy efficient. So you reduce emissions, but you can also reduce costs significantly. And we see two types of electric vehicles. The major type of electric vehicle is 100% electric. It's a battery electric vehicle. It gives us the opportunity to reduce the most amount of emissions. So that's the priority. We also have plug-in hybrids, and they are a transitionary technology. They're different from a normal hybrid because you still plug them into charge and they can run only on electricity for around 50 to 100 kilometers. These aren't a widespread solution, but we think for the next couple of years, whilst we continue to get more battery electric vehicles onto the market, these can play a role in some segments where there's not a fully electric version, or in some parts of the country where there isn't charging infrastructure. So in summary, if you can't plug it in and use electricity to charge it, it's not an electric vehicle. That's the easiest way to think about whether you're talking about an EV or not. Now, why EVs are important is there's a whole range of benefits that can be delivered, and we could literally spend 10, 15 minutes on each of these points, but the main message I wanted to get across is that when you look at electric vehicles, and again, talking about electric cars, buses, trucks, that broader range of vehicles that need to be electrified, they don't just reduce emissions, but they also deliver a whole range of other benefits, whether it's reducing costs, reducing our dependency on imported fuel, supporting other sectors to decarbonize, like the energy sector, so acting as batteries on wheels to support the uptake of renewable energy, and also being able to bring about new benefits that weren't previously available from cars and buses and trucks by charging homes or buildings, particularly during blackouts, to give us that climate resilience, which is also going to be important because unfortunately climate change is already upon us, and we know that even with our best efforts there will be changes that we have to adapt and be able to cope with. So the final point I wanted to highlight in terms of talking about EVs is where Australia sits in the market compared to other countries. So you've probably heard this a lot, but it's not so much of a surprise given the lack of policy and the lack of action we've seen in our country, that we are miles behind the rest of the world, particularly comparable markets, on the uptake of electric vehicles. In part, this is why we don't see a lot of models. So around the world, there's maybe 500 different EV models globally, and that's compared to less than 50 in Australia. In addition to that, other countries are now, well and truly above 20% of all new vehicles sold being electric, and in some cases they're above 50%. Australia is just under 3.5%. So we are very, very far behind. And unfortunately, if we don't do anything, we will see some increases, but nowhere near the rates that we are needing to hit our climate targets. And so this is why it's really important at this point in time, with this opportunity to influence the federal government's national EV strategy, to have some strong commitments that allow us to catch up to these other countries, have more affordable models supplied to our market, and importantly, reduce transport emissions in line with our climate targets. So I've just got one slide here. Lindsay will talk a little bit later about how you can get involved with submitting to the National EV Strategy consultation. But to highlight, it's not too late. Submissions are still being accepted until next Monday, close of business. And I'd encourage everyone on this call, if you have the time, even to take 2 minutes to put in some constructive, supportive messaging for the federal government to take some ambitious policy action forward so that we can get more electric vehicles into our country, provide more affordable options to all Australian households and businesses, and importantly, bring down our transport emissions and transport costs. If you go to our website, electricvehiclecouncil.com.au, you can get some more information there that might help you. And Lindsay also will talk later about some information that Greenpeace can provide to help in putting submissions in. The key message I want to leave here, and we'll unpack this a little bit further in a moment, is what the EV Council is calling on for the federal government to take forward as its immediate priority is the introduction of an ambitious fuel efficiency standard. And this is key because Australia is behind the rest of the world. We don't have this fuel efficiency standard. And without that, we're just going to be a back of the queue last priority for introducing new and affordable electric vehicle models. So we'll unpack that in a little bit more, but I believe we've got a short poll that we're now going to run. Hopefully that will come up in a second.
Thanks, Jake. Here we go. So we're asking if you could take a moment to choose the top 3 topics or themes that you're most interested in hearing about tonight. As mentioned, we've received many questions on many things to do with electric cars and the strategy and the transition underway. If you could just take a moment to let us know what you're most keen to hear more about. Just let that tick over for a moment. I imagine responses are coming in, and then Soph will, I think, share that response so we can see as soon as the majority of people have had a chance to respond.
And while we're waiting, Lindsay, for people to answer that, I think I just, looking through those hundreds of questions that were sent through, it's really exciting to see the interest across Australia in what this means for the future. And I think it is very understandable that, like with anything new, there are some uncertainties. So don't be shy. Don't ever be afraid to ask questions about electric vehicles or any technology for that matter, because there is no dumb question from my perspective and from others as well. This is all new for many people, and it's important that we understand what it means for our future.
Thanks, Jake. Soph, how are we going on the poll? Are we ready to, here we go, share back. So just having a look through the responses here, we can see the top one is that people are keen to know more about this strategy, fuel standards, how they work. I think we'll jump to that maybe straight up. A lot of questions about batteries, a lot of questions about charging, affordability, emissions. Just give everyone a little chance to have a look at that, and we will hopefully try to get to some of the questions that you've asked under all these topics. Any that we don't get to, we have quite a comprehensive frequently asked questions section on our website, and we will be updating that following this webinar tonight as well. All right, I'm going to close that poll now, and we might jump into the sort of first set of questions, Jake, around the fuel efficiency standard. And I can see you've prepared something earlier, so thank you very much. We did get quite a few questions like, what is it? How does this policy mechanism actually work? And in particular, how does it serve to make electric vehicles more affordable for more Australians?
Yeah, and I think this is important because, certainly over the past few weeks and months, that there has been some discussion in the media around what a fuel efficiency standard is. And I must admit, it's been a little frustrating because, again, we've seen a lot of this misinformation out there. So hopefully we can help to address on this call exactly what this policy is. So to be clear, this type of policy is not something completely new. It's been in place for many decades in other countries around the world. Unfortunately, Australia just hasn't adopted it to date. How it works is that a fuel consumption or a carbon emission target is set each year for the average of all new vehicles that are sold by each car maker. So it doesn't ban any specific type of vehicle or ban a specific fuel type of vehicle. Car makers can continue to sell whatever type of vehicle they want, but what they're effectively forced to do through this policy is make sure that on the average of all those new vehicles that they sell in the year, the carbon emissions hit that target. If they don't hit that target, it means they have to pay a penalty, and that penalty can be quite significant. So in some markets overseas, it can be tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So it gives them a very strong incentive then to try and reduce their average emissions for the new vehicles they're selling. Where electric vehicles come into the story is that they're counted as zero. So if you've got your average, you obviously are going to be attracted to selling as many vehicles that count as zero as possible to bring down your average and meet the target. And so in that way, there's a lot of evidence from around the world that a fuel efficiency standard is a very efficient policy for encouraging manufacturers to supply and ultimately sell as many electric vehicles as possible so that they can avoid paying those significant penalties. I've just got one more slide here in the context of Australia. And so on the right here, we've got a figure that shows car fuel consumption or car carbon emissions in Australia versus a range of other countries. And what you'll note is Australia is this red line right at the top. So when you hear this language in public around Australia being a dumping ground for some of the world's most inefficient vehicles, this is what it looks like. It looks like car emissions. These are not all cars. This is new cars, brand new cars being sold in Australia have higher emissions on average than most other countries in the world. And that's because these other countries have brought in place targets to bring those emissions down much quicker. Sure, emissions have fallen over time and improved naturally as technology continues to evolve, but nowhere near at the rate that needs to be achieved for us to hit our climate targets.
Great, thanks, Jake. And so I think that's a really useful explanation of sort of how it works and where we currently stand. Could you maybe speak to like how will it help bring down those costs of electric vehicles and make them more accessible sooner to more Australians?
Yeah, so if we reflect back to that earlier slide where I mentioned there's 500 EV models around the world and we're seeing less than 50 in Australia. What that means is that because we don't have a fuel efficiency standard, we don't have that, I guess, incentive for the car makers to bring more models here, and particularly more affordable models to sell them and bring down their average to avoid paying a penalty. So what we would like to see is the government introduce a fuel efficiency standard and introduce an ambitious one as soon as possible so that that can bring more EV models, more of those 500 that are available around the world into our country. And a nice flow-on effect is that, you know, for anyone that has done anything with a, you know, an economics background, you know that if you have more competition, that helps to drive down prices. And that's one of the problems right now. We have so few models that there's very little competition. And so again, you don't have that downward pressure to bring down costs. So this will have a double effect of bringing in more models and then increasing that competition to drive down costs further, whilst we continue to see the technology costs fall over time as well.
Great, thanks, Jake. I hope that answers the main questions, some of the main questions we got around fuel efficiency standards. Keeping half an eye on the chat, I can see it's very active there, so I'm definitely not sort of able to be across everything, but if there are absolutely burning follow-up things, please feel free to drop them in there. Maybe we'll jump across to a question on charging, or maybe a couple of questions on charging if I bundle a few that have come in together. So just wondering if you could give us a bit of an overview on kind of how does charging work? What about apartments is a question we get quite a lot. What about people in regional areas? And maybe I can come back to this a bit in here, but the sort of vehicle to grid functionality and like when and how will we be able to power our houses with an electric vehicle battery?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about an electric vehicle, as opposed to a petrol or diesel vehicle where you've got one way to fill it up, you go to the service station, there's several different ways that you can charge an electric vehicle. At the most basic form, in the top right corner of this slide, you'll see a power point, and you can charge an electric vehicle by plugging into a power point with a charger that looks, you know, like an oversized laptop charger. It's not the fastest way to charge your electric vehicle. You'll probably get somewhere around 10 to 20 kilometers every hour. But in certain situations where you might be staying somewhere overnight, that's probably more than enough to get you on to your next destination or back home. and it's quite cheap as well. So when you're talking about, compared to maybe $2 per litre for petrol, it's something between 15 to 35 cents per litre equivalent for using that. If you step up, you can then get more dedicated charges at normally at home or at workplaces. They go a bit faster, so somewhere in the order of 25 to 100 kilometres for every hour that you're plugged in. And for most Australians, the average driving distance per day is about 30 to 40 kilometres. So realistically, with that type of charger, an hour, maybe two max per day is enough to then give you your next day's charge. And then on the left side, there's public charging, and that's where there's a lot of attention. We see a lot of focus on the need to have that infrastructure so that when you're going on longer distance trips, you're able to, still do everything that you would in a petrol diesel car and travel those long distances that we have in Australia. So the encouraging thing is that a lot of investment has gone into building a national charging network. And so whilst there's still more work to be done, particularly along the East Coast and increasingly around, Perth in the southwest corner of Western Australia, we're seeing some good infrastructure rollout where, in the near future, every 70 to 100 kilometres, we expect there will be charging infrastructure available for those longer distance trips. It is a little bit more expensive. So, up to around $1 per litre equivalent, but still, I think, when you compare that to $2 per litre for petrol or diesel, you're talking about a significant saving. The other thing that we've talked about very briefly, but we get a lot of interest, and I know in these questions there was a lot of interest around this idea of using an electric vehicle as a battery on wheels. And so the exciting thing is already there are vehicles coming to the Australian market where you can plug in different appliances. So they could be power tools if you're a tradie. If you go camping, that could be, your kettle or, a small microwave. So this can all be run off the battery itself. And in the next couple of years, what we'll start to see is homes being able to be plugged into these batteries and powered for long periods of time, just using the electric vehicle battery itself. So this is exciting because we're not only moving to a future of having zero emission vehicles, but being able to have that independence and that climate resilience by using the batteries in the vehicles for more than just transport.
Great, thanks, Jake. So, we do hear quite a bit about this, are they going to be suitable for people in the regions? Does an EV make sense if you live out in, Ballarat or Broken Hill? I wonder if you could, sounds like you're saying it's not, that's not going to be such an issue.
Yeah, and this is an important issue from the perspective that a lot of Australians don't live in cities. That we have a very large country, and so we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to benefit from lower emissions and lower costs. And to answer this one, I thought I'd reflect very, very briefly on a trip I was very fortunate to take with my wife a couple of months ago. It was a birthday holiday that she had planned for us to go overseas. And the exciting thing was that we went to a couple of countries that have really good charging infrastructure. So we were in the west coast of the US, Canada, Iceland, and also Sweden. And we hired 4 different electric vehicles over that holiday and managed to drive in the course of 3 weeks, 6,000 kilometers. Now, this wasn't, any way impeding our travel. We were more than able to have a really great holiday, not stressed out by running out of charge. And this was because the infrastructure was there. We could travel to quite, remote places. We went up into the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And this was all made possible because these countries have invested in the charging infrastructure, not only in cities, but also in regions. So we can have this in our country. We just need to make sure that government works with industry to roll out that infrastructure so that no one's left behind and that everyone gets access to a charger. The other thing that I just very briefly want to reflect on is that often we talk about wanting to travel very long distances, 800 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers a day. And I do think it's important that we have an open discussion about the road toll in Australia and the impact of accidents that occur primarily and in large part due to road fatigue. And that's from people not taking regular breaks. And, you know, being a scientist, I've read a lot of the literature. It's very clear that you should have a break, not a long break, but, you know, a 15-minute break every 2-3 hours. That's enough to hopefully go have a bathroom, rest stop, maybe get a quick bite to eat, stretch your legs and get back on your way. And then you're not only refreshed, but if you've charged in that period, you'll have more than enough at the current fast charger technology to get to your next stop 2 to 3 hours down the road. So again, this is all possible for all Australians. We just need to make sure we get that charging network in place.
Yeah, great. And that's not actually something I'd heard about the fatigue and the road toll there, Jake, but that makes a lot of sense. You can see you've just flipped over to another image there. Did you want to speak to that one, or?
Just to briefly say, for anyone that is kind of curious, like where is a charger? I haven't really seen one. I want to kind of figure out where they are and maybe go and check it out. There's a great resource called plugshare.com. If you go on there, you can see chargers right around the world, but also in Australia, you can see where the closest charger is to you, and highly recommend going, having a look, getting an idea of how it works. By all means, there's still a lot more work to be done. So don't get me wrong, we're not ready yet for that full transition, but we're heading in the right direction. And again, with a strong, ambitious national EV strategy, in the next 4 or 5 years, we can have a network that largely covers, you know, the majority of the Australian population and ensures that we can all have access to this technology in the future.
Great, thanks, Jake. I'm keen to go to sort of charging and battery questions in a moment, but first I'd like to ask about this sort of affordability question, which I think you've already touched on a bit, but it is obviously top of mind for a whole lot of people. When am I going to be able to afford an electric vehicle? And I can see even some comments in the chat. So when are people going to be able to afford an electric vehicle?
Yeah, look, this is front of mind. I'm very fortunate now that I've had 3 EVs, but you know, I come from a household where, you know, both my parents they rent their apartments. They're not in a position to spend $60,000-$70,000 on an electric vehicle. They have a son that is obviously very clearly passionate about this technology and they want to adopt it, but it's not affordable for them. And they're like many Australians around the country right now, where it's just not an option. I think what we have to recognize is that it's disappointing, but the realities of all new technologies is they start at a high cost, and as you get more produced, those costs come down. And so around the world, we are seeing EV prices fall, which is great. They're heading in the right direction. Again, Australia is missing out on a number of those more affordable models because we don't have that fuel efficiency standard. So I'm a bit of a broken record on that point, but not to underemphasize how important it is that we get that to have the more affordable models. The other thing is just to reflect, if you looked back 5 or 6 years ago, an electric vehicle, quite a number of models were around $120,000 to $150,000. They're now halved to that $60,000, $75,000 mark, with a number of options in the mid 40,000s. And based on the current kind of forecasts, we're expecting that in another 5-6 years, there will be electric vehicle options on the market for $30,000 without any incentives. What can obviously accelerate this and bring it forward is the government actively supporting Australians to reduce the cost of EVs in the near term, and particularly focus on those low-income households so that they can get access to this technology and be able to save fuel and maintenance costs.
Great, thanks, Jake. And just on that sort of point you've got there around fleets on the slide, that's a sort of watch this space for any of the Greenpeace supporters out there, because we will shortly be launching a Electrify Fleets campaign element of our overarching Electrify campaign, which will be pushing major corporations to make full fleet electrification commitments and move a whole lot faster to start supplying that secondhand car market. All right, I'm keen to jump to a couple of the sort of environmentally related questions. And this is one that we get a whole lot. Does it make any difference? Are EVs any better really if you're just charging them from a coal-fired electricity system? So wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point again, that we want to make sure that the technology we're supporting and that we're switching to is going to deliver real emissions. So it's critical that we confirm that is the case. And there's been a lot of research done on this over many years, right across the world, looking at what is the impact in terms of emission reduction moving from a petrol or a diesel vehicle to an electric vehicle. When you do these comparisons, it's critical you look at the full life cycle. So you've got to consider the mining and manufacturing of that vehicle, the use of it, charging it or refueling it, and also servicing it over its lifetime, let's say that 15 years that it has on average that's being used. And then at the end of life, being able to scrap and or recycle and repurpose the components of the vehicle. So you've got to take that holistic view. And what we're seeing is that in many markets like Europe, for example, or even the US that have much lower emissions in their electricity grid, they're seeing more than a halving of emissions over the lifetime of the vehicle, making that switch from a petrol diesel version to an electric. So the key question is then, in a country like Australia, where we know we still have a lot of coal and gas in our electricity mix, is it really any different? So this is a good example I've got on the slide done by the International Council on Clean Transportation. If you type in the address and look for life cycle emissions, you'll be able to pull up this study. And they looked at not only the US and Europe, but also China and India. China and India have very similar electricity grids to Australia. And what they found was that you would still get up to around a 40% reduction in lifetime emissions today, even based on the existing grid. But the exciting thing is, of course, as we get more renewables, those emissions will continue to fall. So it's key we start to transition today and we really push back against that language that it makes no difference, because one, it does deliver emission reduction and it's significant, but two, it also gets that carcinogenic pollution out of our communities. And that's a real cost that we can avoid if we make that shift to an electric vehicle future as soon as possible.
Thanks, Jake. And I guess I would just note on that, we can't underestimate the speed at which Australia is transitioning to that renewable powered grid. We just saw from the Victorian government last week a commitment to 95% renewables by 2035. So, by the sort of 2030s, 2035s, we're going to see almost all of electricity in Australia is generated by renewables. So it is the technology that keeps getting cleaner.
Yeah, and that timing is important because with our vehicle fleet, it's going to take 15 plus years to make that transition. So that's why we have to start today, whilst we know the electricity grid is rapidly decarbonising.
Related to this, though, I guess one of the questions that also comes up is there going to be enough electricity? All this new load on the grid is going to mean more demand for electricity. Will there be enough? How do we do it?
A good question. We've seen some claims that electric vehicles will crash the grid and people really concerned. So it's a good one to unpack. If you took all 17 million light vehicles, so cars and utes and vans in Australia right now, and overnight we switched them to 100% electric, you'd increase the total amount of electricity consumption in the country by about 15%, so 15%. So that's not nothing. That's something that we have to plan for, but we already have well over 20% of our electricity coming from renewables. And as I mentioned before, this transition to electric vehicles is going to happen over a number of years, probably realistically the next 20 to 25 years. So in that transition, we've got time to increase our total electricity consumption by 15%. It's something that we can manage, But we do have to keep in mind that we don't want everyone coming home and plugging in at the same time, charging at the peak hour in the evening. That could cause problems. And so where the thinking is right now is not so much about how much electricity we need, but how we can support people to charge during different times of the day, so that everyone can still get lower costs, but we can also reduce that pressure on the electricity grid.
Thanks, Jake. Can I ask a question now about batteries? I think that was one of the big words that came up in that word cloud earlier. We've had a lot of questions around how long do batteries last? Like, what is the sort of expected life expectancy of them? And then what happens to them at the end of their life? And what are the implications in terms of environmental impact there?
Yeah, so what we've been seeing is that with electric vehicles now being around the world for probably about 12 years, we're getting some really good data on what happens to them over time. And we're seeing that for many manufacturers that have invested in the technology and that have large numbers of EVs around the world, these batteries are going to be good for at least 15 years driving around. Now, the key thing to understand is that a battery does lose some of its capacity. So over those 15 years, whereas you may have started with 400 kilometers, maybe after 15 years, you're down to 300 kilometers, let's say, as an example. So over that period of time, you will lose a little bit of range, but the battery isn't dead. So as you can imagine, 300 kilometers is still a lot of energy. And what we're starting to see in other countries is that those batteries, when they get to what we would call the end of their usable vehicle life, they can be taken out and repurposed to power the grid. So you can then split up those batteries and power a number of homes or provide support at a renewable energy farm. And those batteries will be good for another 10 to 15 years before at the end of their total usable life, so let's say 25, 30 years, you can then recycle around 95% of the battery material and build a brand new battery. So as opposed to petrol or diesel, when we burn that and all that energy is going up into the atmosphere, with a battery, the overwhelming majority of those materials can be recycled and turned into a new battery. And I think, as opposed to where we've had some real issues with AA batteries and those small batteries going into landfill, we're not seeing the same thing happen with electric vehicle batteries because they're just so darn valuable. At the end of life, we've been seeing people spend $20,000 to get a used EV battery, split it up and make a series of other, kind of conversions of other vehicles or other kind of devices that use the batteries. So prices will change over time, but still there will be a significant value at the end of life.
Great, thank you. And hopefully that provides some reassurance to those folks who do have concerns on that front, because I think that is one that we have had a lot of questions about. I guess another one that's somewhat related links to the sort of extraction and mining required for the the minerals that go into that battery production, and it's one that I think we're seeing some of the right-wing shock jocks and others run a bit of a fear campaign around these environmental impacts of lithium. That's of course not to diminish the impact of any kind of mining, but I wonder whether you might sort of speak to that topic and how it sort of maybe compares to the mining and extraction of fossil fuels.
Yeah, look, I think from the outset, it's important to make that point that all mining has an environmental impact, and we have a responsibility to make sure that, those mines are held to, high environmental standards, but also high social and ethical standards to ensure that there are no, labor abuses around the world for the mining of those materials. And, there has historically been some issues in the battery sector, particularly with minerals like cobalt from the Congo, and a lot of I guess shining a light on those issues from groups like Greenpeace and other NGOs around the world has really emphasize the importance to car manufacturers and battery manufacturers of having a clear custody of the materials that they're mining and ensuring that it's done in a responsible way. So those problems are being addressed, and in many cases have now been eliminated from supply chains of a number of those major car makers around the world. And they are now actually using that as a marketing device. So showing people where all their materials are coming from, what the embedded emissions are, what the costs are, so that people know what they're buying and where that material has come from. I think what we shouldn't underestimate, though, is that Australia is in the hot seat for this. So if I just jump forward, sorry, one more slide, Australia has all of the critical minerals that are required to build an electric vehicle or electric vehicle battery. At the moment, we largely ship those materials overseas. We don't add value, but we have a lot of opportunity in this country to build out our full EV industry, and in the future, be able to build cars in addition to the buses and trucks that we already build that are 100% electric, using 100% Australian mined materials that are from, responsible sourced mining companies. So I won't say that the problem is completely resolved, and we need to continue to ensure that those high levels of standards are maintained and increased over time. But Australia has the opportunity to be a leader in this space, have a socially responsible mining sector, and then economically benefit from that over time.
Great, thanks. And I guess one important point to note is that as we move, or once we've moved to that renewable energy powered electricity system and full electrification, we're going to bring an end to all the environmental damage caused by the mining and extraction of coal, oil and gas, which we know has been huge, and we're going to actually see less mining overall under that scenario.
That's right, and it probably we're probably going to jump onto the circular economy. So I'll hold my tongue. I'm preempting the question.
Why don't you go, Jake? We're running pretty short on time, so we've probably got time for one or two more.
There's a lot of focus on the circular economy right now. For anyone that hasn't heard of that term, it's about trying to ensure that we reuse and recycle all of the materials in our society. So eventually we have a closed loop that we continue to be able to use those materials into the future. And that's the future that electric vehicles unlock, so that we can have a time in which those mines are no longer required. We've mined enough material to be able to have a truly circular vehicle economy and recycle those vehicles, those batteries, and build new batteries and vehicles from them. It won't happen overnight. My best estimate is that we could achieve that in the 2040s. So we've still got some way to go to get there, and that's purely an issue of economics and the volume that you need. But we should be heading in that direction. And the key difference to a petrol diesel vehicle is that it's possible with electric vehicles. Petrol and diesel vehicles, they largely do end up in the scrap heap, very little to recycle, and all that petrol and diesel is burnt and in our atmosphere, causing global warming.
Great, thanks, Jake. We are coming to an end. We've got about 6 minutes left. I'm wondering if I can spend the next 3 just firing a few questions at you that we haven't quite got to yet. I'm wondering if you might be able to see if you can do 1-sentence answers to them. We'll see how you go. If you start talking too long, I'll cut you off and we'll move to wrap up.
Hit the gong.
What about utes?
We have many options for electric utes coming to the market in the near future, and watch this space.
Can EVs tow a trailer?
Yes, they can already. We still have more models that need to be introduced to Australia to achieve that. But again, with the right policies, it can happen in the near future.
Are there subsidies available for purchasing EVs?
Yes, there are incentives available in most states and territories around Australia. If you're looking for more information, you can check out the EV Council's latest State of EVs report on our website, evcouncil.com.au.
Thank you. can you convert a petrol vehicle to an electric one?
You can, and there are a number of companies that are doing those conversions. They're generally quite niche and expensive. It's not a solution, I think, for the mass market for everyone, but it has its role in this transition.
Thank you. I've got 3 more for you. What about electric bikes?
Electric bikes are really exciting technology and something that we should also be promoting. This national EV strategy will consider things like electric bikes. So we would encourage you to put submissions in about how the government can work with state, local, territory governments to support electric bikes and give people an alternative to a private car.
Great. I think that preempts my next one. What can members of the community do to speed up this shift to electric vehicles?
First and foremost, make a submission to the National EV Strategy. This is a unique opportunity we have to influence that policy that's been so dearly lacking at a federal level for a decade. So I'd highly encourage you to do that. Speak to your local member and also speak to others in the community about electric vehicles and how important they are to the future of reducing transport emissions, but also reducing transport costs.
Thank you, Jake. That's a very long sentence, but I'll let it in. Finally, and this was one that was submitted, will we have to work 7 days a week if the EV steals our weekend?
Definitely. That's the future that I'm advocating for. I think, yep, with the weekend's over, sorry, we're going to have to say goodbye to that. It's just how it is. No, just kidding.
ScoMo was right.
That's right.
Everyone, let's show ScoMo he wasn't right by making submissions and getting Australia back on track with this exciting electric vehicle transport future. A quick ask for everyone, if you're keen to take action and are keen to throw your voice behind this move, there's 2 things you can do right now. I think that Sophia is sharing in the link in the chat a link to where there's an online Greenpeace portal to make a personal submission showing your support for Australia to introduce a strong fuel efficiency standard. Only takes a couple of minutes. And she's also dropping in the Slack link to our petition. If you haven't signed it, I imagine many of you have already. But please, if you haven't signed that petition, we'll be delivering it to Parliament House at some stage in the near future. Keen to get those numbers up first. We will wrap it up there, but I did just, sorry, a couple of final things. When you log off the Zoom, there will be a short feedback form or poll pop up. We'd love to get your feedback on this webinar. Again, sincere apologies. We haven't been able to answer all your questions. There were very many of them quite specific. We have tried to cover, the most frequently arising questions, and I hope you have got something useful out of the session. Finally, I just want to say a massive thanks to EV Guru Jake. It has been great to have you joining us tonight. Great to be working with you to win this really critical policy. And for everyone on the call, we really look forward to you being involved in this campaign in coming months and getting Australia back on track, winning that important policy, and hopefully all being able to afford an electric vehicle very soon. So thank you all and good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.